co-director from CDHI with us, which is Dr. Filipe Barata. He is our co-director for AI and digital biomarker research, and he has a background in electrical engineering and information technology, as well as a Doctor of Science in Applied Machine Learning in Healthcare from ETH Zurich. He has brought with him a wonderful title and content today. So it's all about digital biomarkers and personalized health. And the title is Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And with this, I would like to just highlight one more time that we record this guest lecture, and Felipe will do the keynote for around about 40 to 45 minutes, and afterwards we will do a Q&A session. And yeah, with this, I look very much forward to this also very important keynote, and hand over to you, Felipe.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Do you see my slides?
Looks really good.
All right, great. So, okay, I'll try to give this title justice today. And again, I'm going to talk about digital biomarkers. And maybe we'll start with a bit of a downer, and I start just briefly with an intro, and I try then to, try to explain our personal view, our specific view on the world. So what is digital biomarker? What do we think when we talk about digital biomarkers? It goes by many definitions. I know the FDA has also some kind of definition out there. I would like to say, in general speaking, when we talk about digital biomarkers, we think about these three parts, these three amalgamated parts. There are digital devices, typical consumer-centric devices. That means smartphones, smartwatches, or any kind of off-the-shelf sensor that you could buy and wouldn't need to build yourself. These devices may collect physiological and behavioral data. So the first generation of those things were in general behavioral data. So this can be misleading, because when you think about biomarkers, you think about biological markers. And third, this data might then be associated or used to infer health-related outcomes. This might be, of course, death, might be a specific disease state like asthma control, symptoms control, and the list goes on. So this is basically the part, and hopefully we can associate or make this statement from the device, the unstructured data which is collected to the device, we find can calculate or determine, let's say, from raw accelerometer data, how many steps you make, and from these steps we can then make an inference about how healthy you are, just to make an example. So what is important here to notice is, and I think I'm appealing here to the computer science in the crowd, is that we assume that our state of health is reducible from a complexity point of view. That means that by measuring just some very specific sensor data, I can make an inference about the state of health. So I don't need to measure all different things which are going in the body. To do so, I can make this by acquiring some specific data, and this is sort of kind of the assumption many times in this research. So if I measure, for instance, with the audio, with the microphone, cough counts, I can use these cough counts to make a statement about the state of health of people with asthma. I don't need to acquire all kinds of information. These might be enough. So I assume this collapses, or in other words, this health of state can be reduced to very simple variables. And this is actually a big assumption. So also in my field, we run many different studies, and sometimes it doesn't turn out to be correct. We cannot just measure the state of health by just focusing on heart rate, to say the least. And this just means that the complexity is much higher. We would require way more information. And this also explains the movement which is going on these days. You shall acquire more sensor data. You shall have this data all the time, multimodal approaches everywhere. And this gives also the justice to this title. Anyway, as we could go down this rabbit hole, but I still believe that it's worthy of importance. Each time that you set sail into one of those digital biomarker research journeys, it's important to determine what's your hypothesis. Why do you think you can measure a state of health just with a few variables. And that's what I'm trying here to justify our hypothesis, our look on the world, why this should be possible. So long story short, I think the use of digital biomarkers, how we envision here at our core, is basically based on two main facts. And one of these facts is essentially saying that mortality is to one extent predictable. So I don't mean that I can necessarily tell the day that you're going to die, but I can more or less put with some error bars, say how long you're going to live. You may be familiar with UN projections. Those exist for any kind of country, but also you may be familiar with concepts with biological age, which nothing else are a better predictor for your death than your chronological age. So, well, okay, mortality is to a certain extent predictable. What else? So the other big fact which I like to put up there is that, um, genetics only explain up to 25% of our health span. That means that our lifestyle, how we go about ourselves, how we behave in life, determines a larger portion of the rest. So, in other words, we are very much responsible for how we live, how our health span is going to be, and so forth. The take on medicine is necessarily what we call prevention. So medicine tries to tackle this issue with prevention. And prevention depends upon the moment in time that we start doing something for it. So tertiary prevention means I'm already suffering from a chronic disease and I try to maintain the quality of life that I have. Of course, I can only do as much. I can do a bit more if I'm doing secondary prevention. This is, I start doing something for it on the onset of this disease. And of course, the holy grail of it all is primary prevention. I try to prevent the development or the incidence of a chronic disease. And of course, this is the most difficult thing to achieve. Also, because we are here in a realm, so to speak, of many times cross-sectional studies where, if you're healthy, you are by definition not suffering from a disease, and determine what is going wrong with you is very hard, also from a ground truth point of view. So this basically sets the stage for so-called digital biomarkers or user-centric devices. So here on top, you see, again, this could be me. I'm typically the kind of person which is doing fine until the moment that I'm not doing that great. Then I go to the doctor. The doctor measures a very accurate data point, suggests treatment. Hopefully, I'm doing better. And this cycle is then to be repeated until the moment that I die. What consumer-centric devices or digital biomarkers, for that sake, bring to the table is the collection of data of the much higher granularity. These data points must be maybe less accurate at the doctor, but by virtue that those devices are always on, always carried along, we can start making inference not only about the state of health, but actually also about the behavior and its effect on health. And this, of course, comes back to this initial discussion that I started with. So for the first time with these devices, we can also make statements about behavior. And this, of course, gives rise to this sort of closing the loop, goes by many names, digital health intervention, digital health therapeutics, and so forth, which means I can collect data from a one point t to t+1, and based on this data, I can try to make inferences about future health states to then intervene just in time. So this all makes sense. Of course, this is a highly difficult thing to achieve. And of course, as started at the start, we sometimes need to think ahead or have hypotheses why we can acquire with certain data, certain information about the state of health, especially with regard to what kind of prevention we are trying to achieve. So if we're gonna move forward and talk about, here a perspective that I wrote with some of my colleagues, it's basically, and this is again to the healthcare system of the 20th century, how Mostly this is done, and this is also true for the most of the machine learning papers out there. So what we try to do, so what you can see here in blue, this is a regular, let's say, chronic disease trajectory as introduced by Murray et al. So typically you can see there is, once you have a suffering from a chronic disease, you will achieve some sort of it's constantly going down. Once you have a change point in your health changes dramatically. You might enter the hospital. Hopefully you start treatment, you get better. And this cycle is again damned to be repeated until one day we die. So as you can see, most of the research these days, especially also with regard to machine learning and digital biomarkers, is targeting to detect this changing point. So we try to detect this changing point in order to intervene in time and avoid this hospitalization. But this, of course, bears many, let's say, also some disadvantages. You could consider that this is not really prevention, because once we are at this changing point, we are already too late to do something, because we know that your health's gonna deteriorate. So what we really try to do in terms of prevention is actually avoid this changing point all along. And to do so, and if we go back to my two facts at the start of this presentation, I think that looking at behavior, particularly repetitive behavior, bears great potential. And this gives another sort of, so to speak, a different way how to develop digital biomarkers for prevention all along. Instead of waiting for the moment in time that your health state changes dramatically, we are more and more interested in trying to find out what's the repeated patterns of your behavior, which repeat themselves and can be associated with negative health outcomes. Why? Again, by virtue of these two facts. Our health, our death is to a certain extent predictable, and our behavior is one of the larger determinants in terms of this death point in time. So we could hypothesize that this is just due to repetition. And if we can identify what parts of our behavior we could associate with the bad health outcomes, then we could do something about it. This is all about the bitemporal lens model. So moving on to give here also start talking about real projects and how those projects can be associated with this vision that I point out. Here are some of the selection of the projects that we work here at our core. So today I want to focus on 3 projects, but also very exciting. I hope this summer we can finally also publish our results, or finalize our analysis on our results, how voice can be associated with heart failure patients, something which also took us very long to finalize the recruitment. We also very much interested in designing methods how to monitor the circadian rhythm. We do some foundational research and try to find novel modalities, how inflammation could be measured non-invasively. We may also be interested in developing small sensors like smart inhaler, open source, and of course the analysis of large data sets, which enable us to study exactly what I've been discussing so far. And here we collaborate with one of our partners, which is industrial partner, which is Whoop. But today I will talk about some of our more long-standing projects here, and this is smartphone-based cough detection, our aging research, and also on one of our software tools that we developed just for the collection of those sensors. So to give this justice and also to try to explain the very title of today's presentation, I'd like you to walk through one of our long-standing applications, and this is smartphone-based cough detection. So what was the idea back then? What we started, this was meant as an application for asthma. So essentially, what we knew as a fact before we started is that the amount of coughs per night, but also per day, can be associated with the state of health of individuals with asthma. So what we thought of, well, then we could maybe develop, an application for our smartphone, which could detect how many times these individuals cough during the night to then associate with a state of health. So why would that be great? Well, asthma is one of the most prevalent diseases or chronic diseases with a 300 million people suffering from it. So using the smartphone would be great because then this solution would scale. And again, all the other solutions out there are sort of effort dependent. So you have to use spirometry tests, which you have to do right in order to it to be able to measure your state of health. So this would be completely passive in the background. So once again, the vision that we had was basically you take your smartphone, you put the smartphone on the night table, and while you're asleep, we'd measure how many times we'll cough. And based on this amount of coughs, we could then associate with the state of health. So now, very simple, and something that we started in 2016, and till this day, very hard to solve. And I still receive, questions. People would like to collaborate in order to use this technology. And why just to illustrate why such a simple use case can be so difficult, you can see this based on our research questions. So the first research question that we had here, and this is all published work, I will just cover very simple aspects here to illustrate why it's difficult to develop generic digital biomarkers or general digital biomarkers. The first question is, how can we develop a machine learning model which works or does cough detection equally across devices? So different devices means different audio hardware and therefore different quality. And this might drop the performance, something that we had to investigate. And also it did. So we had to find solutions to cope with that. Second research question, the most intuitive: how can we develop a machine learning model which does, cough recognition and also could be deployed on a smartphone? This, of course, has to be done the best way possible. Thirdly, and this, by merit of this application, as you could envision by my previous slide, the smartphone has to be placed on the night table. So it's not in contact with the individual itself. So what happens with more than one person is coughing in one room, then we need also to associate or assign the specific cough to the corresponding individual. And finally, well, this is fun and games, right? You can solve this all with data and demonstrate in your scripts that your models really work, but nothing convinces more than a validation study in the field. So you have to develop your models, deploy this on an app, and then run an additional study to demonstrate really how well this works in real life. And I will just basically focus here on the last research question or present results. To the last research question, please refer to the corresponding papers, or please don't hesitate to ask questions at the end of this presentation. So how did we do it? So what was our approach? Our approach was fairly simple in that sense that it follows this regular activity detection pipeline, if you like. So if you see here in blue, you can see the incoming audio stream. We take out of this incoming audio stream, we extract windows. These windows pass a very simple dB filter test, which basically says there is signal in it or there is silence. After this step, we compute some sort of visual representations of sound, so-called MEL spectrograms, which then serve as the input for an ensemble of neural networks, which is a composite number of neural networks, which then output a probability. Is that a cough or not? So in very simple words, we have incoming audio stream, we extract windows, and from these windows, we compute a probability which tells us if there's a cough or not. So this is basically the idea. And of course, we built, and I think this was our largest or best or biggest contribution here, was to develop a specific neural network which could run on any or in the most smartphones and still achieve a very high accuracy. And so we try to, optimize with some tricks and make this more efficient, this architecture, at the same time benefit from these advantages that neural networks have. And this is like this efficiency. If you scale them in depth, they can really represent very complex patterns, at the same time generalize very well due to their distributed representation. And this was, I think, one of the final studies, our validation studies that we ran during COVID here. We used it during 9 patients. Again, this is the full system. You can see it on the left where the smartphone was placed. We also integrated a dashboard for doctors, which they could monitor the cuff counts um, during the day or during the patients in the ward. And this was basically it. And here on the right, you can see our results. So we achieved a plus minus 5 cuffs, 95% confidence intervals, and a repeated measures correlation in comparison to human annotators of a 0.95, which demonstrates that our system worked. Of course, not perfect, but at least in principle showed the efficacy to be able to run in the field. So this basically illustrates a very example, if we go back to the bitemporal lens model, of how a system could be used to monitor an acute disease, or is it a change, like a change point. But if we aim to really do prevention, as I mentioned before, we need also to try to capture repetitive patterns and try to also study them, what they mean for our health. And this I like to talk here in terms of aging and longevity. This is a work that I did with Ginger Shim, and she has now moved on to the Harvard Medical School. So what was the idea here? The hypothesis, or how we approached this, was basically we tried to think here first from a lens of circadian rhythm. So what is the circadian rhythm? Circadian rhythm is one of the 2 processes that regulates our sleep. Typically, we can measure this by the melatonin, by measuring melatonin, which is produced during the night. And it's also something, which we all have, let's say, have a chronotype, or means it's a very specific characteristic of all of us. So some of us might be more alert in the morning and be fitter for cardiovascular disease in the afternoon, but at the same time, when these times specifically might differ for each of us. So some of us are night owls, some of them are, early birds. This is all described by the circadian rhythm, but essentially describes the rhythm that aligns with the movement of the sun. And essentially what the literature seems to suggest, or already suggested before we started, well, if we are not in line, we are not in rhythm, with the ideal rhythm that we should have, then this may cause chronic inflammation. This may lead to the development of chronic diseases and essentially cause increased mortality. So by capturing this rhythm, or let's say this circadian rhythm disruption, we could maybe potentially make a statement of longevity, again, by virtue that repetitive rhythms or repetitive behavior might have a large effect. So how did we approach this? Again, the motivation is that we could use a digital device like a smartwatch to collect, data about accelerometer and assess when we move and when we don't move, like a proxy from our circadian rhythm, essentially saying, well, when are you asleep, when are you not, are you moving during the wrong hours, etc. And this, of course, has the same advantages as always. This would be scalable, would able to assess, our state of health with regard to prevention and so forth. So how did we first start? So again, before we just went all in, we first think, well, can we sort of identify profiles within this accelerometer data which can be associated with longevity? And so we run a cluster analysis to do so. Here we worked on this enhanced data set, again, a very large data set, but the data which fulfilled our requirements was nearly 7,000 individuals. This data was up to 14 days of 24 hours actigraph data, and it also includes ground truth. That means different blood measurements and questionnaire information. So what resulted in this? And just to cut the chase short, here you see the depiction of 5 classes. This means once we took the 7,000 individuals, and data of this accelerometric data of these 7,000 individuals over these 14 days, we ran a cluster analysis, and the result was these 5 clusters. And you can see here very distinct. These clusters are normalized. That's why you get also negative values. You can see at first cluster 1. This means just you are highly active. Here in blue, this means that you have a lot of movement during the day. And you can also see very with a very different from cluster 1 is cluster 5, where you can see only negative values, means very low movement in comparison. And of course, cluster 2 and 3 are a bit in between. But what I also would like to draw your attention to is cluster 4. Here you can see not just movement during the day as in cluster 1, you actually can see movement during the wrong hours, during movement during potentially during the night or during times that we would be likely asleep. So just bear this in mind. Now we went on and computed associations with these specific clusters. So not surprisingly, the cluster with high activity is the one with the lowest inflammation with regard to these results. And you can see here some bit of a gradient effect moving from left to right. And of course, as expected, the one with the highest inflammation is the cluster which had the lowest movement. But most interestingly is again cluster 4. As pointed out, this was the cluster which was the cluster which had movement during the wrong hours, during the night. And you can see here that it performs second last in comparison to this, or with regard to lower inflammation, saying, well, this at least seem to suggest, movement is important, but it not only matters that you move, it also matters when you move. And this is basically the first indication in that regard. Of course, we also computed this for other outcomes, not just inflammation. Here we used another metric for biological aging that is computed purely out of blood biomarker values, and this is what we got. Again, the same results. The healthiest is the one which is the most active. The least active is cluster 5. And in second last, again, the one with the, let's say, suggesting here a potential circadian rhythm disruption moving at nightly hours. So, okay, this was the first sort of research question. And this was very encouraging because it was telling us, well, maybe looking this from the lens of rhythmicity with regard to longevity might actually very good or very interesting. So what we try to do as next, can we now develop a completely biological age metric purely based on accelerometer data? And can we then compare this with disease incidence, mortality, and other metrics for biological age? And that's what we just did. Here we even used more data. So we used 2 publicly available data sets. Before I mentioned the NHANES data set, which is a data collected in the USA, but this time we also used the UK Biobank. So what we did, use 70% of this data of the UK Biobank to develop this new metric of biological age that we're gonna call Cosner age, and use 30% for its validation and a complete external data set in addition for its validation. Again, both of these data sets contained up to 14 days of accelerometer data and also different ground truth, which enables us to compute all the other necessary information. So what was our approach? So what we did is essentially a so-called causal analysis. So people which are familiar with circadian rhythm research might be aware of this. So what it really does is we take the accelerometer data and we compute here activity counts. You can see this here marked in orange. And in orange, we then try to fit a simple cosine wave. We essentially a very simple cosine wave. So if we have 6 days of this data, this gives rise to 15 million data points, which then can be reduced with 3 parameters only. And this is basically such a wave function, if you like. And if you want to see the math here, I put it out here, please. nothing to be too scared about it. So basically, this cosine function can be expressed with 3 parameters only. So we assume that the frequency here is this, again, 24-hour rhythms. So we can have the acrophase, that means describes the peak activity, the timing of peak activity. The amplitude is the half of the height of the peak activity, and the measure, which is sort of an estimate on like the average activity level. With these 3 parameters is basically what we try to fit to these activity counts. And with these 3 parameters, we then try to develop a metric of biological age, which means we assume a certain distribution, the so-called Gompertz distribution, that we fit to the data. So cutting again the chase short, here you can see the first result. So basically what we did here is cosine age, that's our new metric of biological age, and here we compute correlations with existent already biological age metrics. So it's Clemera-Duval, which is computed also blood biomarkers, 13 or so, and the pheno age and so forth. And you can see we achieved very or at least strong correlations with the biological age metrics, which are focused on, let's say, blood biomarker values, but not only that, have substantial more values for their prediction, where in our case, we just use 3. But of course, this is just a correlation, and of course, what does it really mean? There's a lot of fluctuations in those values. What we went on doing was basically, does our metric of biological age also have any discriminative power? So what we did was basically, okay, we tried to create 2 buckets with our data from our patients, essentially saying, putting them in the ones which are fast aging, meaning the patients which had a higher biological age than cosine age, and we used the ones which were slow aging, basically the ones which had, a higher chronological age with respect to their cosine age or biological age. And we can see purely now on metric that this sum or still very discriminative. So you can see in terms of time and a risk of mortality to neurodegenerative disease that up to 6 months before this event, death, the ones which are aging fast were way more likely to die in comparison to the one which had slow aging. And you can see these results for cardiovascular disease mortality, neurodegenerative disease incidence, cardiovascular disease incidence, and diabetes incidence. Well, it sounds interesting, but of course, some people will say now, well, yeah, okay, this is fun, Filipe, but does it really just do with rhythmicity? Could it not be that you're actually just capturing a physical activity? So we run the same analysis, just focusing in physical activity without considering any rhythmicity information. And this is basically the results that we achieved. And you can see here in comparison that, considering rhythm, plays a much role, enables a much stronger statement about longevity in individuals, suggesting that our initial hypothesis, at least, that behavior repeats itself and enables us to make a statement about aging. Well, this is again an example about our aging research. We also went on in trying to predict exact, times, determine using machine learning, and try to determine how old people get and so forth. I leave this out, but essentially just saying that there is a great potential to develop, a digital metric, a digital biomarker for longevity, and in addition, potential digital intervention for that matter. So finally, I want to conclude with Clyde, with our data collection platform that we have been developing. And maybe I'll start here with, this sounds trivial, but I like to start with a motivation. What is Clyde? What is a data collection platform? Data collection platforms in our world, in our research, is sort of one of the key requirements. Without having such sort of a tool which we can collect data from consumer-centric devices, we can basically not do research. But at the same time, creating such a platform is a gargantuan task, and the requirements to do so are nearly impossible to fulfill them all. And here I tried to list them just for this audience, what is required for such a platform once you collect data. This not only means that such platforms make sense from research, but also if you really truly believe in having apps on your smartwatch, on your smartphone, which could generalize across all devices, we would need some sort of software solution which would enable so. So from a software point of view, if we create such a software that enables us to collect data from any kind of devices, we need modular components. And once we integrate a sensor, we would like to be able to reuse these sensors. And each time we'd like to integrate a new sensor for the data collection, that should be likely to be easy. Those are, of course, modularity and reusability. In addition, additional requirements, of course, we need to be able to collect this data, and this data needs to be analyzed, ideally configurable. So sometimes we like to have, high granularity data. We want to determine how many steps you did, and sometimes we just require to see if you are above a certain threshold. So all those things matter, and so how to set this up and have the freedom to design software which is that flexible, this is of course very difficult. And finally, also the requirements with verification and validation, right? So how can you make sure that that changes between different OSs, operational systems, are as little as possible? So we have some sort of verification claims. And at the same time, this software should also be used to collect data in clinical settings and so forth. So some usability requirements are needed too. So again, very challenge, and we try to, of course, have our shot at this, and we developed Clyde to actually help us tackle exactly this sort of data collection and this data and help us analyze. Here we already did an introductory work that we published here, a great work together with Patrick, which developed this very nice framework, I would say, and of course fun, which also ran the first study which demonstrated its efficacy in the field. So one of the biggest advantages of this Clyde network, again, also by meeting the previous requirement as good as we could, is essentially the following. And here I'm talking about, again, digital biomarker research. So how does this end? Typically, most of the studies go the following way. So we design a study, we develop an app to collect data from participants, we analyze this data, and then we publish it. And then it's done. But as you can know, if we really are serious about translational research, and if you want to make sure that these models that we develop based on this data of these sensors are again applicable, we have to close the loop, and we have to find solutions which can easily make it reintegratable into these original apps. And that's basically what Clyde just does. So basically, even if you analyze your data, prefer to analyze your data, let's say with Python or in R, you can integrate those models back into the software that you use to collect this data very easily and run additional validation standards, which then help us, of course, have a higher impact on medicine and enable translational medicine. So that's it here, a collection of the main functionalities of Clyde. We are also here collaborating with Stanford on trying to, make this platform even more powerful and help, other researchers with it. So it's platform agnostic, it's open source, it fulfills so-called network transparency. It doesn't really matter where it's run on, it runs with the same modules, it's cross-language. We fulfill both platforms, and we hope to have conceived in such a way that's reusable and flexible. Well, please, don't be strangers. Please check it out, and we are always happy to answer any questions. That's all for me. That's all for today. I'd like to thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, dear Filipe. Great. So let's give our audience some seconds until we see here the first raised hand. Who's first? You can, of course, also always write your comment or question in the chat, in the text chat. If you're on the way, if the background noise is too loud. Well, maybe I do the breaker here and start with the first question. Filipe, I think you have lots of experience now with devices, wearables, etc. I saw Whoop on the first slide. Do you have a general recommendation what is good enough? And maybe you have now a lot of experience with like, the physical activity, accelerometer data. When I remember back in the days, you could potentially go with a Garmin SDK, also pay maybe a lot of money to get high frequency data and then use these, commercial variables versus maybe I saw you also used research grade or data from research grade variables. Any recommendations for researchers interested in physical activity, for example, or come up with other examples, whether we have to spend a lot of money to get very precise data at the end, or whether consumer variables are good enough? And of course, I'm sorry, it is kind of a high level question, but maybe you can provide some insights based on your research.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I think, it depends all on the parameters. There are parameters that you can, get out of data which are completely robust, and there are other parameters that are not so robust. So I talked to you here. I mentioned this Cosiner analysis, fitting a wave function to activity data and extract them. So this turns out to be super robust, works very well with smartwatch data and with Actigraph alike. Very, very equal, no problem. Even very robust to missing data. If you have some days out, it still like fits nice rhythm. But this cannot be said for all kinds of data out there. Many times also, those research grade devices don't publish all their pipelines, so it's very, very hard to reproduce those results, and then you cannot achieve the same kind of correlations if you're trying to verify and validate those results and so forth. So all those things are in general very difficult. So, but again, the main question is always, what are you trying to do? Or what are you trying really to do? Are you trying to replicate what another sensor does? Or are you trying to capture a very, very pattern that exists? Or this is basically the question. And sometimes you can pose this research question independently of the gold standard, even though the gold standard measured is something else. So if you want to, let's say, find out if somebody moves regularly in the afternoon, I don't think an actigraph should there be necessarily better than a smartwatch. But again, it's a different research question. If you want to find out what are the number of activity counts between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then obviously people would encourage you to use an actigraph. So I think it all comes down to these details. And for some questions, it's necessary to investigate. In our case, we ran a second validation study where we compared smartwatches with actigraphs. So I can now make this statement.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks a lot. I see already someone turned on the video, so now
Yes. I would have a question. I know from type 1 diabetes therapy that there are like these continuous glucose measurements that you can put on your on the skin, and then you have like every 5 minutes you have a data point on what's your current blood sugar. Did you also have a study where you, instead of using, or maybe in combination with smartwatches, where you use this technology also?
No, not yet. But this is highly interesting. So, in general, people think about these in multiple generations. So, of these sensors. So, the first generation we had a look into physical activity and behavior. The second generation was all about heart rate data and so forth. and what's going to be the third generation of this. Of course, glucose meters are very exciting. Of course, they are somewhat invasive. Some people also try to investigate sweat these days to make a statement, and maybe some people even say that sweat is going to be the next big thing. So it's a bit of the question how this will play out. However, with regard to your question, yes, getting any kind of inference from your metabolism, especially with regard to, repetition, how do you eat, how healthy is this would be super exciting and totally worthy of a study.
Thanks.
Maybe Filipe, sorry, directly linking to that question. You mentioned it also to some degree, if you would start kind of a new research direction with the idea to have the maximum impact in terms of intervention based on the biomarkers we can measure. Would it be on physical activity? Would it be on diet and nutrition? Would it be on sleep? What would it be? Like, where do you think do we have the biggest impact on, longevity in terms of these behavioral areas?
Okay.
All at once, probably. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think, what I think in this regard is really, everything everywhere all at once, especially when it comes to longevity, because I think the angle that people are saying, it needs more personalization, I think it's true. So I believe that certain behaviors might be healthier for others, people, and we need, of course, to quantify them first. And once we are able to quantify them for each individual, we can then, specify which tools we can use and make it more simple for them to use. So I think you can have higher impact or focus on more simple measurements with regard to the specific chronic disease. That all being said, and I think if you want to have most biggest impact on regard to longevity, I would try to suggest you to approach it similar to what we did. So basically, okay, I'm think, there is literature out there which tells me that this behavior is important. So now the question to you would be, how can I repetitively measure this behavior? So I not only measure it once, I need to be able to measure it over and over again. And can I establish a pattern? And if you can, then you can try to associate this with your outcome. In our case, it was the circadian rhythm. How are people in line with this circadian rhythm? And then you can then try to make a statement. And here I would suggest to do the same. If you can make a statement about how people eat, however that means, with regard to their rhythmicity or a glucose meter and so forth, and then associate with longevity outcomes, I think that might be possible. And again, is there data out there or not? But I think in repetition, quantifying repetition, there is the key, rather than the approach that I said at the beginning, especially with regard to longevity here, is that people try to determine this window is bad for you. Now here something went wrong, and therefore this has consequences. So, and this is much harder to do.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Any other comments or questions? In the meantime, I have, of course, another one. Will you offer a kind of a summer school or workshops? I remember last year you had a workshop on clade. Will there be something in 2025 or next year?
No, I don't think so. We were debating of going to Ubicom. In the other hand, it's a bit colliding with some of, some PhDs ending. We are a bit in the transition moment, but I hope this year might not work out, but the next year to come, I hope we are back. And there is also we're trying to collaborate with Stanford to combine a bit of both platforms, Spacey and Clyde. So let's see what the future brings.
Okay, cool. All right, but then I think documentation. I mean, here for the others, of course, I'm aware of that. But the link you shared, there is documentation available, and of course, you would be, of course, more than happy also to answer questions, right?
Of course, yes. Those tutorials are there, so we can also allow other people to do it. Of course, it needs a bit of preparation and time, but we are always happy to share. There are other groups also within ETH using it already. So for some use cases, it's really beneficial. I think we put a lot of work on the Android system. So I think this is, works. Obviously, in the end of the day, we didn't solve the problem in all possible cases. So we hope also that other people like it and help us solve them.
Okay, great, great. Wonderful. All right, so that was the last opportunity for anyone else to maybe think about a question and comment, and I give you, just because of the Zoom delay, another 3 seconds. Yeah, it seems that's it. Dear Filipe, thanks a lot for this presentation. It will be made available with your agreement on our website, so that those who couldn't attend, because maybe some of us are still on the Eastern holidays on the way, etc., you find it on the very same website as the keynote was announced. Maybe Victoria can, provide that link one more time, but I think for all of you that did attend already here, it doesn't make so much sense. But you will definitely find also our next keynote, when I remember correctly, by Rea Lena, a former colleague from the Singapore ETH Center. I look very much forward to that one. And big thanks one more time to you, Filipe. Thanks a lot for today's keynote. Yay.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.